What if the most dangerous form of morality isn't evil, but absolute certainty? Because once a principle stops negotiating with reality, it doesn't just guide behavior, it begins to overwrite survival itself. And that's where this story begins, not as a tragedy about ancient law, but as a psychological system where conviction becomes a force stronger than life. In the world of Thebes, law is not neutral. It is a living structure, part political control, part sacred belief. One layer claims authority over bodies. The other claims authority over meaning. And between them, there is no safe space. Only collision. A silent question emerges beneath it all: who gets to define what is right when both sides believe they are protecting something sacred? Antigone exists inside this fracture, not as a rebel in the modern sense, but as a role-locked entity of moral absolutism. Her influence is not political, it is existential. She does not argue for justice as a concept, she behaves as if justice already exists in a fixed, unchanging form. And that is where the system becomes unstable. Because certainty, when taken to its extreme, removes the possibility of compromise and replaces it with sacrifice. But here's the contradiction that destabilizes everything: the more absolute the moral conviction becomes, the less room there is for human continuity. A principle that cannot bend begins to break everything around it instead. Not because it is false, but because it is complete. And this is the first memory fragment of this system, a forbidden act of burial, not as rebellion, but as symbolic enforcement of an invisible law. One person acts as if the moral order is real. Another acts as if only political order exists. And reality itself becomes the battlefield between two truths that cannot coexist in the same system. So we reach the first escalation: what happens when law is no longer a tool for stability, but a definition of identity? When obedience becomes survival for one side, and betrayal of existence for the other. Creon, as the embodiment of state authority, does not see himself as a villain. He sees himself as a necessary structure. Stability requires clarity. Clarity requires enforcement. But enforcement, when pushed far enough, stops distinguishing between protection and destruction. That's the paradox embedded inside the system: the same mechanism that preserves order is also capable of collapsing it. And now the scale shift begins to emerge. This is no longer a conflict between two individuals. It is a prototype of civilization-level tension: what happens when a society cannot tolerate multiple sources of moral legitimacy? When right is not debated, but enforced. Because once that threshold is crossed, every decision becomes irreversible. And here is the deeper consequence already forming beneath the surface: in systems built on absolute duty, survival is no longer the highest value. Integrity is. And integrity, once detached from flexibility, demands cost. Sometimes that cost is reputation. Sometimes it is relationship. And sometimes it is life itself. But the most unsettling question is not what is lost, it is what is justified in the process of losing it. So the real mystery begins to surface: is Antigone acting with clarity, or is she simply the final expression of a system that no longer allows alternatives? And if both moral certainty and political order require sacrifice to sustain themselves, then which one is actually preserving humanity, and which one is consuming it? Because the moment a society cannot distinguish between duty and destruction, it doesn't collapse loudly. It collapses with certainty. The deeper question is not whether law or conscience is correct, but why both begin to fail the moment they demand exclusivity. Because once a system defines rightness as singular, it quietly eliminates the possibility of shared humanity. And in Thebes, that elimination is already underway, not through chaos, but through structure. The conflict now sharpens, not as an event, but as a role collision between two irreconcilable authorities. On one side, Creon represents institutional coherence: his logic is simple: a state that cannot enforce its laws dissolves into fragmentation. On the other side, Antigone represents moral continuity: her belief is equally absolute: a law that ignores higher truth becomes illegitimate, regardless of consequence. The system does not allow them to both be partially right. It forces totality. And that's where the first structural contradiction appears: the more each side tries to preserve order, the the more reality becomes unstable. A key memory fragment emerges here, not as action, but as symbolic resistance, a burial that is not about death, but about recognition. A single act becomes a declaration that some obligations exist beyond political permission. And that is where influence begins to shift. Because influence in this system is not measured by power, but by what actions force reality to acknowledge. But here's the escalation: what if both sides are actually defending the same thing, just through incompatible definitions? Creon defends order as survival. Antigone defends order as meaning. And meaning, when pushed to its limit, becomes indistinguishable from obligation. This is where the psychological system fractures. Because humans do not survive on logic alone, they survive on structures that tell them why survival matters. Now the scale shift deepens. This is no longer a disagreement between authority and resistance. It becomes a civilization test. Can a society hold multiple truth systems at once without collapsing into enforcement wars? Or does every unified system eventually demand a single moral center? And the consequence begins to surface more clearly. When moral legitimacy is split into absolute domains, compromise is no longer seen as resolution, it is seen as betrayal. That is the hidden transformation. The moment negotiation becomes impossible, every action becomes symbolic, and every symbol becomes irreversible. Creon's world cannot tolerate ambiguity. Antigone's world cannot tolerate compromise. And the system they inhabit does not offer a third space where both can coexist. That absence is not accidental, it is structural. But here is the revelation beginning to form beneath the surface tension: systems that eliminate ambiguity do not eliminate conflict. They only delay it until it becomes existential. And that leads to a disturbing realization. If both law and conscience require absolute loyalty to function, then conflict is not a failure of the system, it is the system expressing its logical endpoint. Now the mystery sharpens: is Antigone a moral outlier resisting authority, or is she the inevitable output of a system that turns conviction into self-destruction? And if Creon represents stability, why does stability itself require outcomes that feel indistinguishable from collapse? Because at this stage, the question is no longer who is right. It is whether rightness itself has become a mechanism that the world cannot safely contain. The system does not break when truth collapses. It breaks when truth becomes too rigid to absorb reality. And that is exactly where the structure now enters its most unstable phase. The deeper question emerging from this tension is no longer about who defines morality, but about what happens when morality itself becomes a closed system, incapable of adaptation, yet still demanding obedience. At this point, both Creon and Antigone are no longer operating as individuals. They function as role embodiments of opposing moral infrastructures. One is built on continuity of state logic, the other on continuity of sacred obligation. But what makes this conflict escalate is not disagreement, it is mutual non-negotiability. Each side begins to act as if compromise is not weakness, but corruption. And that is where the system quietly shifts from ideological conflict to structural crisis. A critical memory fragment emerges here, not an event, but a symbolic enforcement of meaning through action. A single forbidden act is no longer just resistance, it becomes a declaration that law without moral recognition is incomplete. But from the opposing perspective, that same act becomes proof that moral conviction without structure is chaos disguised as virtue. This is where the contradiction sharpens into escalation. Because now, every interpretation of reality becomes mutually exclusive. There is no shared language left that can safely translate between them. And here is the turning point: when two systems cannot translate, they begin to eliminate each other's legitimacy. The influence of Antigone is no longer personal. It becomes contagious in structure. Her act transforms from individual conviction into a replicable logic. If higher law exists, then state law is conditional. Meanwhile, Creon's authority hardens in response, because if law is conditional, then authority is already dissolving. This is the moment where stability begins to behave like pressure, not balance. Scale shift intensifies. What started as a moral disagreement inside a city-state begins to resemble a prototype of civilization-level incompatibility. The question is no longer about Antigone or Creon. It is about whether any system can survive when it contains two absolute truths that both refuse to yield. And now the consequence reveals itself more clearly: systems that demand total moral alignment do not produce unity. They produce inevitability. Every action becomes forced toward its extreme interpretation. Every decision becomes a test of loyalty to an idea that cannot be partially followed. There is no middle ground left that does not look like betrayal from one side or the other. And here is the emerging revelation: the system is not failing because of conflict. The system is functioning exactly as designed, by escalating contradictions until only one principle can survive. But this leads directly into a deeper instability. If the structure requires one truth to eliminate the other, then truth is no longer discovery. It becomes selection under pressure. And selection always has a cost. Because now the mystery expands beyond the characters themselves. It is no longer about whether Antigone is right, or whether Creon is justified. It becomes a far more unsettling question: in any system that allows only one absolute moral center, is conflict a bug, or the inevitable method of deciding which form of humanity gets preserved? And if that is true, then what exactly is being saved when everything else must be sacrificed to prove it? The most unsettling realization is not that both sides believe they are right, but that the system itself may require their opposition in order to define what right even means. And once that thought emerges, everything shifts. The revelation begins here: a morality inside this structure is not a fixed truth waiting to be discovered. It is a functional tension system, designed to only become visible when it is in conflict. Antigone and Creon are not anomalies within Thebes, they are expressions of a deeper architecture that depends on collision to define legitimacy. Without opposition, neither law nor conscience has meaning. They only become intelligible through resistance. This reframes everything. Antigone's act is not simply defiance. It is a role expression of absolute moral visibility, where meaning only exists when it is pushed to the point of irreversible consequence. Creon's authority is not simply control. It is a role expression of structural stability, where order only exists when it is enforced against contradiction. And here is the first deep insight: both figures are not trying to destroy each other. They are completing a system that requires both forces to reach its full expression. A critical memory fragment becomes clear here: the forbidden burial is not just symbolic resistance. It is a structural activation point. It forces law and morality to reveal their incompatibility in physical reality. One act becomes enough to expose that neither system can remain partial under absolute interpretation. But this leads to a deeper consequence: when systems rely on extreme expressions to define themselves, moderation is no longer stability. Moderation becomes invisibility. Only extremes generate meaning. And that is where the true instability emerges. Because societies built on absolute frameworks do not collapse when they fail. They collapse when they succeed too completely in enforcing singular meaning. Scale shift intensifies again. What appears as a personal moral decision now reveals itself as a civilization-level design flaw. Any system that requires total alignment between law and morality eventually produces scenarios where survival itself becomes secondary to coherence. In other words, the system begins to prioritize being logically consistent over being livable. Creon's authority, from this perspective, is not merely political. It is a mechanism that defines reality through enforcement. Antigone's conviction is not merely ethical. It is a mechanism that defines reality through sacred necessity. Both are operating as competing reality definition engines. And when reality is defined by competing engines, conflict is not accidental, it is structural verification. Here lies the second revelation unfolding: neither character is acting outside the system. They are both executing its deepest requirement, which is to force truth into a single, non-negotiable form. The tragedy is not that one is wrong. The tragedy is that the system cannot function without forcing truth into a position where someone must become wrong. Now the consequence deepens further. If truth requires enforcement to exist, then truth is no longer independent of power. It becomes something that must be selected, enforced, and defended. And once truth becomes enforceable, it inherits the same instability as power itself. And this is where the final question begins to surface, quietly but inevitably. If both moral conviction and political authority only become real through opposition, then what exactly remains of truth when opposition is removed? Is truth something that exists independently of conflict, or is conflict the only mechanism through which truth becomes visible at all? And if that is the case, then the greatest revelation is not about Antigone or Creon at all. It is about whether meaning itself can exist without something to resist. The deeper realization is not that truth is fragile, but that truth in this system was never designed to exist in isolation from conflict at all. And once that becomes visible, everything reorganizes around a single disturbing core revelation. Truth here is not a destination. It is a product of structural opposition. It only emerges when two incompatible moral systems collide with enough force to force visibility. Without that collision, neither system fully exists in a meaningful sense. Antigone does not simply represent moral law, and Creon does not simply represent political order. They are both role-lock generators of meaning, each requiring the other as a condition of definition. This is the core revelation: the system does not contain truth. It produces truth through irreconcilable contradiction. And that changes the interpretation of every prior assumption. Antigone's conviction is not merely personal morality elevated to extremity. It is the activation of a logic where moral legitimacy must be proven through irreversible commitment. Creon's authority is not merely political control. It is the enforcement mechanism that gives structure to collective survival, even when that structure becomes morally unbearable. Neither side is incomplete. Both are structurally necessary. But together, they generate a condition where compromise is impossible without destroying the clarity of the system itself. A critical memory fragment re-emerges here with new meaning: the act of burial, previously seen as symbolic defiance, now functions as a reality stress test. It forces the system to declare which form of legitimacy overrides the other. Not through dialogue, but through consequence. Meaning is extracted through irreversible action. And here is the insight expansion that follows: in systems built on dual absolute authorities, morality is not a shared space. It is a battleground where each action is a declaration of which reality will persist. The consequence of this structure is not immediate collapse. It is something more subtle and more dangerous. It produces societies where every moral act must escalate to the point of finality in order to be recognized as valid. Small compromises disappear, not because they are wrong, but because they are invisible within the system's logic of meaning. Scale shift becomes unavoidable at this point. What begins as a conflict between a ruler and an individual becomes a model for how civilizations handle competing sources of truth. Every institution that claims absolute authority over meaning eventually produces its own Antigone moment, where another system of legitimacy refuses to remain subordinate. And in that collision, the question is never about who is morally correct. The question is which system is allowed to define what correctness even means. This leads into a deeper philosophical tension: if truth only becomes visible through contradiction, then truth is not stable. It is conditional on the existence of opposition. But if opposition is removed, truth does not become pure, it becomes undefined. So what remains is not harmony, but silence. And that silence carries its own consequence: a world without conflict of meaning may not be a world of peace, but a world where meaning itself no longer has a way to appear. And at that point, the question stops being about law, morality, or rebellion altogether, and becomes something far more unsettling. If truth only exists when systems collide, then what happens to reality when nothing is left to collide with it? The most lasting consequence of a system built on irreconcilable moral forces is not destruction. It is inheritance. What remains after the collision is not resolution, but structure, an invisible framework that continues shaping how meaning is produced long after the original conflict disappears. And that is where the consequence of this entire moral architecture becomes fully visible. Once truth is only generated through opposition, societies begin to internalize contradiction as a requirement for meaning. Nothing is understood unless it is contested. Nothing is valued unless it is defended. And nothing is considered real unless it survives resistance. This is the hidden shift that defines everything left behind. A critical memory fragment returns here with heavier weight, a single act of burial that once functioned as defiance now transforms into a template. Not for rebellion itself, but for how legitimacy is proven, through irreversible commitment. The act stops being about one individual. It becomes a repeating logic embedded into moral systems. Belief must cost something to be real. And that cost spreads. Antigone's influence does not end with her choice. It evolves into a pattern of thought where conviction is measured by sacrifice, not flexibility. Creon's influence does not end with authority. It evolves into a pattern where stability is measured by enforcement, not adaptation. Both roles leave behind legacies that outlive their original conflict. But here is the deeper consequence: once these two legacies exist simultaneously, every future system inherits the tension between them. That is the expansion phase of this architecture. The conflict does not remain inside Thebes. It replicates across any structure that tries to unify morality and governance under a single authority. The same contradiction reappears in different forms, sometimes as law versus conscience, sometimes as ideology versus survival, sometimes as principle versus pragmatism. The names change, but the mechanism remains identical. Scale shift becomes historical at this point. What began as a collision between two individuals becomes a recurring civilization pattern, systems oscillating between absolute order and absolute conviction, never stabilizing at a midpoint because the midpoint is structurally invisible within the logic they operate under. And here is the legacy that emerges from this cycle: societies remember not the resolution, but the intensity of the conflict. They inherit not agreement, but frameworks of justification for sacrifice. Over time, morality itself begins to carry the imprint of this structure. People begin to believe that meaning must hurt to be valid, and that stability must be enforced even at emotional cost. This is not a story about ancient law anymore. It becomes a psychological inheritance embedded into how humans interpret obligation, authority, and truth. Even in modern systems, the trace remains. Whenever a decision is justified by saying it isn't necessary despite the cost, the echo of this structure reappears. Whenever conviction is praised more than adaptability, the same architecture resurfaces. The system does not disappear, it migrates. And this leads to a deeper reflection: if meaning is always born from tension, then every attempt to eliminate tension also risks eliminating meaning itself. But if tension is preserved indefinitely, then collapse is never resolved, only postponed through repetition. So the legacy is not closure. It is continuity of contradiction. And now the question becomes unavoidable. If every system inherits this structural conflict between survival and meaning, and neither can fully exist without undermining the other, then what exactly are we building when we call it order, stability, or a carefully maintained form of unresolved tension that only appears stable because we have learned to live inside the contradiction? What lingers after the collapse of an absolute system is never clarity. It is awareness of how fragile clarity always was. And that is the final insight this entire structure leaves behind: meaning is not something that exists independently inside morality or authority. It is something that appears only when forces collide hard enough to make interpretation unavoidable. Once that collision stops, meaning does not become peaceful, it becomes undefined. The legacy of this dynamic is not a single story or a single figure. It is a pattern of human behavior that repeats whenever conviction and structure demand total ownership of truth. Antigone does not survive as a character. She survives as a role imprint of irreversible belief, where the value of an idea is measured not by its flexibility, but by the cost required to maintain it. Creon does not survive as a ruler. He survives as a role imprint of enforced coherence, where order is valued not for its empathy, but for its ability to suppress fragmentation. A final memory fragment rises here, not as an event, but as residue, a single forbidden act that once divided law and conscience now remains as a symbolic trace of how systems decide what reality is allowed to mean. Not through consensus, but through consequence that cannot be undone. And this is where the human meaning becomes unavoidable. Because beyond the systems, beyond the roles, beyond the collision of law and morality, what remains is a reflection of something far more intimate, the human need to believe that meaning must be stable in order to be real. Yet every structure that tries to stabilize meaning eventually reveals the same hidden cost. Stability is never free. It is purchased through the suppression of alternatives. And what this story exposes is not a failure of morality, but a limitation of how certainty behaves when placed inside living systems. The more certainty expands, the more it compresses everything around it until only one interpretation of reality can survive. But human beings do not live inside singular interpretations. They live inside tension, ambiguity, and contradiction that never fully resolves. Which is why this structure continues to echo far beyond its origin. The legacy is not about choosing between opposing forces. It is about recognizing that every attempt to eliminate opposition also eliminates the conditions under which meaning becomes visible in the first place. And every attempt to preserve meaning through absolute conviction eventually risks turning that meaning into something that cannot adapt to life. So what remains is not a lesson, but a reflection that refuses closure. If truth only becomes visible through conflict, and stability only becomes possible through limitation of that conflict, then the deepest question is not which side is correct. It is whether human beings are ever meant to resolve the tension between meaning and survival, or whether that tension is the only reason either of them can be recognized at all.